Hello and welcome to Social Studies 3201, Unit 4, Population. Last time around, we looked at 10.2, uh, Demographic Transition, and in that outcome, we looked at how populations change, usually as a result of scientific or technological discoveries. For example, disease control through vaccines or better sanitation, access to birth control, but also through social changes. For example, females taking on greater roles in the workforce and therefore delaying families, or the age at which they would have families, and therefore numbers of children would decline as well. So, demographic transition is just one model for how population changes, and it tends to be the one referenced quite a bit. Um, Today, we'll take a look at population pyramids, which go hand in hand with population change. And population pyramids are really just a tool that demographers use in order to describe populations and potentially identify issues with populations. So, if we look at what a population pyramid is, it's a graph that shows the structure of a population by age and gender at one point in time. So, a population pyramid uh, will always have a year, labeling it usually, and this will show that this is a population profile for a country at a given time. So a single population pyramid is not meant to show change, but a series of population pyramids can help us um, take a look at population change. Okay, so we get a breakdown of the population by um, male female balance and age. So, for example, here on the left, on this side, we have uh, the male population, usually on the left, and it's quite often indicated in blue. And on the right here, we've got some pink bars, or sometimes they're red, which are used to indicate the female population. And this line going up the middle will show ages of population. So, for example, down here you might have all the ages from 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so on up the graph. So the idea is you can get a picture of the population at any given time. And I should say these numbers for these graphs on the side are usually shown uh, as a percentage of the total population, but sometimes they indicate actual numbers as well. So the purposes of these graphs, besides being a neat piece of information that we can look at in geography or social studies, is that they help us indicate which stage of demographic transition a country may be experiencing based on certain characteristics that we see with male and female population and age. But we can also use them to help us identify problems that a country might have because of its population. Okay, so we can see here we have a population of the world, population pyramid graph for the world for the year 2017. Total population 7.5 billion over here. And we'll note we have the ages going up the side here. Sometimes they're indicated in the middle of the graph. Other times they might be on the left side. But again, they go up in 5-year intervals. And down here at the bottom, we can see we have a 0% here in the middle, and we have the percentage population at each age for males over here on this side and for females over on this side. Okay. So there are a number of different types of population pyramids you can have or shapes which show different characteristics of populations. That's what we'll take a look at now. The first of these is called an expanding population. And that's a population that is growing or increasing because of a high birth rate. Okay, so on a graph like this, we can see that the youngest ages down here take up a significant portion of the population, right? The bars are the longest. Um, and that indicates that that's where the greatest number of people are in the younger ages. So that tells us that there is a high birth rate. There's a lot of kids being born. Um, we get a high death rate, which is seen by a rapid decrease in age groups of people over the age of 65. So let's say from here up, okay, all the way up to 90, 95, 100. Okay, so we'll see that this is the smallest portion of the population, and that's going to be true for most um, population pyramid graphs. Okay, the older people get, there's usually health issues, um, and deaths are a major concern there. Okay, so a graph like this with a high number of young people should indicate a growing population. You can have an issue where the older ages, or even from middle age to the older ages, are so small, which indicates a significantly high death rate. As we learned last time around with demographic transition, if you have a scenario where the birth rate is roughly equal to the death rate, your population isn't going to be growing. It's not going to be declining. It's going to be remaining roughly the same. So, depending on the shape of this triangular pyramid shaped graph, it could indicate that a population is either expanding or growing quickly, or maybe it's showing a stationary population, which would match with the first stage of demographic transition. So this graph would probably be a little closer to the stationary side of things. Now, if the side of the pyramid was a little wider on both sides here, then that would indicate that people are living to be a bit older, so therefore the death rate is going to be lower. That's when the population would really start to expand, and that'll be when we get into stage 2 of demographic transition. And final point I should mention is that these expanding population graphs usually indicate LEDCs or lower or less economically developed countries. Okay, and we'll see why as we go through the rest of this unit. But more or less, the big picture would be that it links with lower levels of scientific and technological and social development, as opposed to MEDCs that have in some cases, a considerably higher degree of all three of those. So if we look at the other side of this, you could have what we call a stationary population. And this would be closer to your stage 4 of demographic transition. And it's just a matter of degree, really, that distinguishes the stages here. And if we look at this population pyramid, we'll see that the population is staying roughly the same. We know that because compared to our last graph, the birth rate is going to be quite lower. Okay, we can see that both for males and females, there's a fairly low number of births. But the key thing to help us determine that it's a stationary population is that the number of births is roughly equal to the number of people who are old enough to have kids. Okay, so we're looking at around about 3%, 3.2% on this graph in terms of age groups. So that means that the population of people who are of childbearing age are replacing themselves. They're producing roughly the same number of children. So that would be a family of 2 parents having 2 children on average. So we see that we have a declining birth rate. As we already mentioned, this bottom part of the graph gets narrower the further along demographic transition we go. But we also have a low death rate. We'll notice compared to the last graph that up here, people are living to be older. Okay, so that shows definitely that there's more people living in to be seniors and living into old age. So therefore, the death rate is going to be low, and that's usually a result of things like medical development, sanitation, and so on. We mentioned childbearing age groups are replacing themselves, as indicated by the percentage numbers here at the bottom and the middle of the graph. And as we said, the middle of the graph is roughly the same width as the bottom. And this generally indicates an MEDC of one sort or another. Okay, so lower birth rates due to better healthcare, sanitation, and social equity for females, and lower uh, death rates, meaning people live to be older, due to uh, mostly better medication and better healthcare as well. So together, uh, these things will produce a population that stays roughly the same, which we mentioned in the last graph, but it is a different scenario here. This would be an example of stage 4, where the birth rate and the death rate is lower. The last graph for an expanding population would have been more like a scenario where the birth rate is high and the death rate is high. At the end of the day, population growth in both cases are going to be roughly stationary. It's when you get populations transitioning from uh, stage 1 to 2 that we'll see the middle of the graph start to widen out with people living to be older. And when we move to a situation, when we go from stage 3 to stage 4 of demographic transition, that's when we'll note that the bottom of the pyramid contracts and starts to become roughly equal to the middle. Now, that said, there is one final shape that we can have to a population pyramid, and this is the contracting population. Our example here is Japan. We're using the same year here, 2017. And the biggest difference here that we see is that the top of the pyramid has gotten larger or wider, and the bottom of the pyramid continues to get narrower. So this indicates a decreasing population because your birth rate continually is declining, but people are living to be older and older. So you get a low death rate, low birth rate. Quite often, the scenario here is that the birth rate actually goes down lower than what the death rate does. So therefore, you will have a contracting or shrinking population. Right? You have even fewer people added to the population than people who remain in the population. So childbearing age groups are not replacing themselves. And this is, even though we got Japan here for the example, this is the scenario Canada is finding itself in today. In order for a population to replace itself, it needs to have a total fertility rate of 2.1. And that just means that each female in the population in her lifetime has about 2 children to replace the current adult population. But in a contracting pyramid scenario, the total fertility rate is less than 2.1. So you could have 1.7, 1.6, 1.3. And so these countries are the ones that would be at greatest risk of a shrinking population. And as we said, the bottom of the pyramid is narrower than the middle, which is the big giveaway here. And this is also indicative of an MEDC. So technically, this pyramid doesn't fit in any of the stages of demographic transition 1, 2, 3, or 4. So this has led demographers to believe that, well, maybe there's a fifth stage after stage 4, in that populations will start to shrink over time as birth rates continue to get lower and lower. And it's usually the most advanced countries, socially and economically, that experience contracting populations. So we have Japan, uh, some of the countries in Western Europe, Canada, another good example of that. Okay, so contracting populations, one of the biggest issues that this type of population would have would be that because of the low birth rate, there's going to be perhaps a lack of workers for the economy. Okay, so as middle-aged people here get older and older, and it adds to an aging population, those seniors are going to need health care, they're going to need services, um, and they're going to take up a larger and larger portion of the population over time. But a low birth rate is going to mean that those um, younger groups, as they become old enough to enter the workforce, there's not going to be enough of them to fill the need in the economy. So this is where migration becomes a serious uh, response that countries will look into, and Canada's done that in the last few decades, increasing the numbers of immigrants allowed in, partly to fill workforce gaps. Uh, right. So if we look here at a summary of these stages and try to match them up with demographic transition as a whole, we can see our stage one is here. It's an expansive shape pyramid, but uh, population itself is growing very slowly, if at all. So this is more of a stationary scenario, high stationary. Um, and we can see that by the very, very small uh, numbers of seniors and a very large number of youth. As we move through to stage two, um, our early transition here, we can see that the sides of the pyramid are starting to widen out. So some of the age groups that are younger in a large population are getting older, and due to better medical technology and medicine, they're living to be older. So the sides of this pyramid are going to be wider than the sides of this first pyramid over here, indicating a growing population. Okay, so it's an expansive shape again, but it's more of a growing population. So this is your stage two of demographic transition. Okay, uh, where disease control is probably the single biggest factor affecting population change. Okay, so you still have a high birth rate, but your death rate starts to decline, and that's where the single biggest change is. Okay, third stage, late transition. In this case here, we have the birth rate starting to decline somewhat. It is your stage three, where you see birth control, a lowering infant mortality rate, changes in the economy, where large families are not necessary to maintain agricultural activities, people moving to urban areas, having smaller families, that kind of thing. Well, at the same time, your medical uh, technology, medical care, medical systems improve. So those people um, who would normally start to uh, succumb to disease and illness at a younger age are actually able to live to be older now. Okay, so you see a wider part of the population up here. Okay, so this is still a growing population, but the rate of growth is starting to slow down. Okay, and in some cases, it's actually towards the end of demographic transition, you might see uh, a stabilizing of the population somewhat. Okay, and that can be indicated by um, the numbers of uh, people in the youngest age groups being roughly equal to people in the middle age groups. Okay, so This graph is mostly matching up with a stage 3, but there's some crossover into stage 4. Further crossover uh, when we get into stage 4 occurs in the low stationary stage, where we start to see birth rates continue to decline to the point where uh, there's actually fewer people uh, being born, and people, the majority of the population living to be older. So you get a larger number of seniors, large number of people in the middle age groups, but the youngest part of the population uh, declining in number over time due to families continually having fewer kids. So your total fertility rate here is certainly going to be less than 2.1. It could be 1.7 or so on. And this is more or less the stage that Canada would be in today, as we mentioned before. So the basic shape we would say would be contractive or contracting, very low birth rate matched with a low death rate. So therefore, this would be more people uh, living to be older and even fewer people being born, as we mentioned a moment ago. You get even longer life expectancy due to better social conditions, better healthcare, nutrition, any number of factors. And so these four population shapes more or less match up with the stages of demographic transition. Starting over in the early stages with contracting or with expanding a pyramid shape that first starts as stationary, but as people start to live to be older due to better uh, healthcare and disease control, you'll start to see the population increase quite dramatically. Then we get a shift into stage 3, where disease control has already happened to some degree, but also, again, we get um, birth numbers starting to go down. The birth rate goes down due to changes mostly in the economy and in social aspects of civilization. And finally, we get that pattern continuing where more and more people live to be older, and people are having smaller and smaller families. And therefore, we get into our um, contracting shape. So, for these pyramids, um, we've basically talked about how they work, what they show, so you can indicate problems with populations at given stages or likely problems that these populations would have to face. For example, in stage 2, uh, high numbers of young people, there's going to be issues with providing adequate education in terms of services and the costs of doing so and that type of infrastructure. As we get into stage 4, for example, with a declining birth rate, uh, quite a low birth rate, you'll get the highest portions of your population are going to be older, living longer, but requiring much more of a strain on the healthcare system in order to support the elderly. So there's issues in terms of providing adequate medical care, uh, using of tax dollars for the healthcare system, and so on. So at this point, we've got an activity 10.2 population pyramids. And basically, this is going to look at some different population pyramid shapes with some examples and um, involve some analysis and exploration of the issues that these sample countries might face.